Welcome back to the Stigma Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hayes, and today's guest is Dr. Amit Etkin, founder and CEO of Alto Neuroscience and professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. He's also a member of the Wu Tsai Neurosciences Institute at Stanford, and he has received multiple awards for his incredible work in the field of psychiatry, most notably the NIH Director's Pioneer Award in 2017. Dr. Etkin is trained as both a neuroscientist and psychiatrist. The overarching theme or aim of his work is to understand the neural basis of emotional disorders and their treatment, and to leverage this knowledge to better understand how the brain works and to guide current care and to develop novel treatments and interventions for mental health differences. In support of this goal, Dr. Etkin also collaborates with neuroscientists and engineers and psychologists and physicians and others to establish new intellectual, scientific, clinical programs for understanding and manipulating human brain circuits in healthy individuals and treating psychiatric diseases. I first met Dr. Etkin by way of introduction from our mutual friend, Tom Insel, in early 2020. I was immediately blown away at what he was working on, and I knew instantly that it would radically transform psychiatry. I absolutely had to be a part of his mission and honestly begged him to let our fledgling What If Ventures be a part of it. Thankfully, he eventually let us come alongside and be part of the mission at Alto Neuroscience. Without further ado, I want to dig into what he's working on, why it's so game-changing, and I hope that you can see what I saw when I first met him a couple of years ago. Amit, thank you so much for being here. It's truly an honor to get to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Excited to be on and looking forward to it as well.
I would love to start with having you share a little bit about your bio background and kind of how you found your way into the field of psychiatry.
So I've always been interested in neuroscience, really since undergrad, actually, where some of that interest came from the perspective of philosophy. But what really moved me into this was doing my MD PhD, which I did at Columbia, and doing it in the laboratory of Eric Kandel. I was there starting in 1998, took 8 years to do the MD PhD, the combined degree. And he got the Nobel Prize in 2000 for his work on learning and memory. And Eric is himself a psychiatrist. Actually, his foundational work is in sea slugs, and that's really where he got his Nobel. But his interest is also in psychoanalysis. So really, really spanning the gamuts from invertebrates to the mind. And that really got me excited about using neuroscience for the service of improving outcomes, improving understanding in psychiatry. Initially through work in animals, eventually during that time, during my MD PhD, moving to work in humans, then came to Stanford for my psychiatry residency, got the clinical training. And then it's really all about how to ask the right questions from there. And that, I think, has dominated not only my career, but my approach to how I think about things. And you can see it just from that history. So if you couple clinical training, you're really understanding what real world patients are going through, and a basic science training that teaches you a lot about how the brain works, but you can really clearly see the gap between how we understand basic mechanisms and anything that's relevant to patients. My whole career afterwards has really been in trying to bridge that gap. So I went on the Stanford faculty, actually while still a resident, as a fourth-year psychiatry resident, and just launched from there trying to understand people and how people differ and how we understand that biologically. But the whole time carrying this thread of understanding the brain in basic enough ways that we can really get at mechanism, even if it isn't necessarily taking things all the way down to what a sea slug would teach us, but keeping that at least in spirit alive.
And you mentioned this concept of asking the right questions, and based on some of our conversations about what's going on in the broader mental health field in psychiatry, clinical psychiatry, you've helped me figure out what some of the questions are to ask. So I wanted to propose one to you and start with, what is kind of the biggest need in the clinical psychiatry world with respect to this sort of trial and error prescribing of medication that we see today?
So to put it most simply, we just need treatments that work, full stop. And by work, I mean not just slightly beat placebo in a really big study of people who don't really represent real world care, but really work so that patients, when they go in, have confidence that this is the right treatment for them. And then the outcomes match that expectation. It feels like so often what we're wrestling with in psychiatry is not just trial and error, which is such a massive problem, but expectations are so low for any one thing working out. So if it were trial and error and we'd have a good shot maybe by the second time of finding the right drug, that might be okay and people might put up with it. But our expectations are so low, it might take many drug trials in years. And in many people, even that doesn't work. So my ambition, and really what led me ultimately to leave the lab and create Alto Neuroscience, the startup I now lead, is that idea that we really need to find treatments that work. And the best way to do that is by lining up treatments with the right people for those treatments.
And how do you do that? How do you line people up with the right treatments? Or how do people do that today? Is anyone successful? How do we get to that place? Is that even possible?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely possible. And in fact, I would be disappointed if it were not possible. And it's certainly the focus of all of our efforts now today at Alto. Let's look at this historically, and I think it might become more clear how it could become possible, and in fact, maybe much closer at hand than we had always thought. So historically, and by historically, I mean for the last 4 or 5 decades, we've developed drugs in entirely one way, which is we make an assumption that a diagnosis made clinically, for example, depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that is the meaningful category in which to put people. And by knowing that category, it tells you what drug to give them. And that just lines up. You have a diagnosis, no real test to give you any further information, and the answer pops out of that. The thing is, that really hasn't worked. And what we've seen over the last number of decades are two phenomena. One is that the effect of any of our medications, which is looked at on an average population level, is very, very, very small. And there have even been arguments about whether it's meaningfully different from placebo in the first place. That's been a big argument around antidepressants. The second is that the vast majority of drugs fail development because their signal isn't just a hair above placebo. It's kind of within the noise when you look at things on average. And so what has happened the past 15 years is big pharma has left drug development for the brain. And so now there's nothing. There's no tools, there's no drugs. And we have a number of smaller biotechs coming up now, but historically there really hasn't been much for the past decade plus. And even those biotechs are taking the same approach as has always been taken. And that really comes back down to how those initial studies were done and how the field has always thought about things, which is in that idea of the clinical diagnosis, if you're not measuring any other aspect of biology, the answer you're going to get is going to be poorly informed. It's going to lead to trial and error because there's just not the information captured during the drug development process that would inform clinical care. So we have to start by literally taking that first step of measuring anything biological. And then, of course, try to do that better than measuring anything by measuring very particular things that we think are important. And we can talk about that in more detail a little bit later. But just imagine, right, if we measure anything, it's got to be better than the trial and error that's done now. Any ability to segment the population so you can even slightly enrich for responders in your drug study, in your development study, it's going to pay dividends when you get into the clinic.
So when it comes to, if I break my leg, I can get an x-ray and I can find the break, and then I can know later by x-raying again if it's healed or not. What do we measure when it comes to our mental health? What can we measure? What has been measured? Where do we even begin to measure?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think to a large degree, we default to first principles on that. So we know that psychiatric disorders are disorders of the brain. They are, of course, experienced in the first person. They're experienced subjectively, but they're disorders of the brain. So we should measure something about the brain. The brain itself can be measured in different ways. We measure brain activity actually in several ways. One of them is directly measuring the brain using something called electroencephalography or EEG, sometimes called brainwave recordings. And those are essentially sensors that you put on the head non-invasively, much like you put an EKG on your chest to measure electrical activity of the heart. The EEG measures electrical activity of the brain. But the brain puts out a lot of other signals you can measure just as well. For example, if you have the person doing a task on a computer that tests their attention, their memory, their ability to learn, their ability to respond to rewards, their emotions, all of that can be tested in objective ways in our readouts of brain function, even when it's not directly measuring the brain. Their activity patterns during the day, when they go to sleep, how long they're asleep, what is the structure of their sleep in terms of stages, how do they respond on a smartphone, how do they interact socially in their lives. There's so many outputs to brain function that we could measure. One really just has to start by measuring anything at all. But it becomes even more compelling if you can put a suite of these things together that start to speak to each other and describe the person. So if I tell you this person has attributes A, B, and C, for example, they are slow at making decisions cognitively, they sleep too much, their pattern of sleep stages is disrupted, so they're not consolidating memory as well during the course of sleep, you can start to get a picture of that person and trying to go from measurement back to person and say, this is a whole picture we've just described with these measures. And now let's use this to describe a group of people for whom we develop a new medicine targeted to their biology by virtue of measuring their biology. In fact, you see this is not new in a sense in other areas of medicine. We don't go to one simple example, right, is you have an infection. You don't just take a single drug to treat all infections. You need to know if it's bacterial or viral. The treatments are going to be very different. And so we need to do some test. You don't go to your doctor if you have heart failure or chest pain and they give you a heart failure or chest pain medication. They give you a test. It doesn't diminish from your experience of the illness, just like we don't want to diminish from people's experience of their psychiatric illness, but it provides information. And in psychiatry, that information has just never been recorded in the process of doing drug development, and as a consequence, doesn't get recorded in clinical care.
And what's changed today? Why is this now available to be recorded, or why is this now being recorded?
So those are two different and interesting questions, each in their own right. So part of it, I think, is just thinking differently. And therefore, by thinking differently, you do differently. I think we've gotten to the point over the past 15 to 20 years where we've realized that we're pretty disillusioned with the status quo in terms of clinical care. And as I mentioned, a lot of pharma has left development of drugs for the brain, so we have no real pipeline to get excited about. So that disillusionment, starting to look at other ways of doing things, has gotten married to a push that the National Institute for Mental Health did about 10 years ago to start looking at the brain more directly as a primary organizing principle for understanding psychiatric disease rather than just symptoms, which is what we've done for decades historically and hasn't really led us anywhere. So all of that has provided the fuel, but then also that now gets married to, I think over the past 5 or 10 years, a much greater focus on data and measurement in life in general, just in our day-to-day lives. The concept that data is the new oil, right? That a lot of value comes out of measurement of anything. Those two things have gotten married, and I think that makes this timing now perfect for this, plus machine learning approaches that really take advantage. It's a confluence of these things. But ultimately, I still bring it back to needing to think differently. What we see out there right now, still to this day, in terms of how all of the companies out there are developing drugs, medicines for the brain, for any psychiatric disorder, it's still without measurement.
And you had mentioned this concept, we've talked about this before, this concept of precision psychiatry. Can you Tell me a little bit about what that is and how the type of measuring that you're doing with the EEG, et cetera, how that paves the way for this concept of precision psychiatry.
Yeah, absolutely. So the term precision psychiatry refers to, in essence, a branch of precision medicine, which I think a lot of people would have heard about, or at least might be familiar with it at a certain level. And what precision medicine says is that different people respond to the same drug in different ways. And that's because their biology is different. The form of their disease is different. It's been really well developed in areas like oncology. And so certain people should get certain medicines that fit their conditions. In psychiatry, the field of precision medicine logically therefore exists. In fact, I would argue that there really shouldn't be anything that's not precision medicine. But it hasn't really been fleshed out historically for all the reasons we discussed in terms of there not having been measurements. So precision medicine, as applied to psychiatry, precision psychiatry basically would mean starting out with an idea of, beyond the symptoms of the illness, what other attributes of that person and their illness and their brain can I index their disease on? I can have, for example, somebody who has better decision-making and worse decision-making, more negative emotion, less negative emotion. You can ground all of these things in measurements, or I can talk about their brain circuitry and how certain brain circuits are organized and connected. By then partitioning people, you can start to find the right treatments for them. And it's, by the way, not just in finding new treatments, it's in every kind of intervention. And I think that's what's, to me, most exciting here is the ability not just to think about creating new treatments in this way, but that we can leverage a whole lot of information to help us get there faster by looking at existing treatments. So we've done both. And the way I've looked at it is there's signal in everything we do. And speaking from the perspective of a clinician, there is a lot of signal in those frequent day-to-day clinical interactions that we have that, where a clinician diagnoses a patient with a condition, they give them an intervention, whatever that intervention is, and the patient either responds well or they don't. So let me take that apart a little bit so people, I think, can really understand how all of this comes together and how truly there's tons of information out there that we can start to leverage. We know that for any treatment, whether it's psychotherapy, medication, or brain stimulation, only minority of people respond. The majority of people don't respond at all. We have, in my lab at Stanford and now through our work at Alto, we've found things like brain activities measured by EEG and even things like fMRI, which is another way through what's called functional magnetic resonance imaging of imaging brain activity, that you could tell these people apart. And not only that, you can tell them apart and it's reproducible. So I can go from one population to the next and I can find those people biologically. So all of the clinical interactions happening today, if we were to have data on them, would start to inform us about how to split these populations up. If you take that concept now that builds on all of the kinds of treatments that we do have and bring it to the world of developing new medications, the potential is huge for taking the exact same approach, but now bringing out new medications that are no longer trial and error and are effective because they are targeted to particular people based on their biology. That's precision medicine. In our view, in my view, coming from the perspective of now developing these medicines, I think precision medicines are here for all of these reasons. We just have to put them to work.
And so how are you taking all of this understanding about testing and measurement, everything you've explained about imaging the brain, being able to tell people apart by that imagery, how is all that coming together to the world in Alto Neuroscience? How are you bringing this to market?
Yeah, so one core perspective we've taken is, well, maybe in the end, all of those medications that had been developed by pharma and haven't gotten to market over the past number of decades, maybe those medicines actually in the end did work, but our thinking about mental illness is what was wrong. So there's actually a lot of tools for modulating brain activity in the form of medicines that have just been sitting in pharma collecting dust because they haven't known how to use them. That is, potential drugs we can bring to people, to market, that do things differently from what the current drugs that are out there do if we can figure out who the right people are for those drugs. So that's part of what we've done is we've brought some of those in from different pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies, which are all drugs, all candidate drugs around which we have conviction. And then we create others in different ways. For example, putting existing drugs that are already approved together in novel ways that synergize with each other that were unexpected and uniquely powerful. So if you start with that perspective, that there are actually drugs out there that move the brain in useful ways, and what that also means that there already have been in human trials, that is, we know at least something about their safety, the potential becomes quite evident for taking a large number of these, doing fast-paced human trials where we're getting a lot of this kind of data we call biomarkers, so measuring something about the brain or behavior, which you could generally call a biomarker. And through a tech-like flywheel, sort of an iterative process of learning and adapting and listening to your data, you can very quickly come up with an idea of who the right people are for these different treatments and then develop them out for those people. Or, well, maybe moving the brain in some way that we thought was important just turned out not to be clinically effective and you drop those. So it's sort of this adaptive, data-driven focus on stratification or splitting the population into biological subgroups that can drive a huge amount of knowledge in a way that's never been done before, facilitated by the fact that the drugs already have known safety in humans, and so we just run with it. One of the other aspects of this that's important is the value of the data itself. So we think of traditionally, the field has thought of drug development in very binary ways. You do a study and it either succeeds or it fails. In our view, that's actually a very limited perspective and one that harms our ability to develop these medicines and bring them to patients. We collect so much data on people, so much of this biological and clinical data. Even if the drug was ineffective, the data are useful. And having that data, having the ability to start bringing surprising parts of the ecosystem of data and clinical populations and ages and genders and all of this together to drive understanding, that gives you so much greater capacity to learn quickly and correct your mistakes that we have to also, I think about the process of drug development differently, more like a tech company might iterate on a solution through testing one thing versus another, what's so-called A/B testing. You can bring the same feeling to how we develop drugs in humans. That's never been done before. That's really not even been remotely on the horizon. But you can see how building that tension and getting something that's in the clinic where you're really kind of going head to head, one kind of bit of data against another, one population against another to quickly iterate to the right answer. That's incredibly exciting, incredibly powerful, and I think, frankly, brings solutions to patients in a much nearer term.
It sounds like your ability to gather information on these biomarkers and to evaluate that information, it really could turn drug development upside down and really take it to a whole new level in the central nervous system drug development space. Is that a fair way to think about it?
I think so. We are uniquely placed today to look back at what has happened over the last number of decades. And of course, with hindsight, everything seems obvious, right? But because we're uniquely placed to look back, we're also uniquely placed to take advantage of all the things that have actually been good and have been developed in the past and put them to work in the right way. That, I think, could be transformative. Taking decades of work, but now directing it in the right way to the right patient, it would make me just extremely happy to see that filter into the clinic, filter into the world of treating patients. That changes the nature of the game. And it's not even a subtle thing that, maybe when you go from like 10 drugs to 11 drugs or 12 drugs that are on the market, this is a very much 0 to 1 process. Right now, all of the medicines we use in clinical practice are prescribed through trial and error. Right now, all of the mechanisms that we have to even manipulate through a drug are extremely limited. In something like major depression, we've just had one drug that's a new mechanism over the past 20 years, and that's esketamine. And there's one drug in a related condition, postpartum depression. But there's been none in PTSD. There's been none in addiction. And bipolar depression has very limited selection. It goes on and on and on. Autism has very limited availability of any drugs. Even schizophrenia, which has a lot of drugs, are very limited in terms of what they do. So going from trial and error and limited selection of drugs to new mechanisms targeted to the person and therefore more effective, that's a 0 to 1 process. I'd like to think about it kind of in the future, looking back 5, 6, 7 years from now, when these start to come out into the clinic, and there's hopefully not just one but multiple of these. Looking back at how we're doing things now, how is that going to look? How is it going to look to do trial and error with basically the same kind of drug over and over? It's going to look just completely inappropriate and out of place. And that's what I want us to sit with. That feeling of transformative change is actually not that far away if we think and do differently. And then who will want trial and error? Who will want to take a drug that might take months, weeks to months to find out if it works, and then go cycle from one to the next? Who wouldn't want to take a test that could identify the right drug for them? And hopefully that drug at that point exists, or in the very near term, a drug would exist for them.
So it sounds like the traditional drug development route or process of trial and error has really held psychiatry back for quite some time, even to the point where it's pushed a lot of the big pharma companies out of the central nervous system space. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's a failure of imagination has led to a failure of drug development and then a failure in the clinic. And I think that's how it flows downstream. So our view is go to the root, fix the creation of drugs, and that will change clinical care, because ultimately our goal here is to transform clinical care. And the way you do it is, I think, by fixing the root cause. But this is not just the drug companies that have gotten out that's the driver of this frustration. There's a lot of other things that come around it. For example, patients get frustrated by the lack of variety of medications in trial and error. They drop out of treatment. People actually thinking about whether they even want to go and treat psychiatric patients and develop their career around it experience that frustration, and some may not do that despite their desire to help people. People who are currently in the field and treating patients, nobody likes to be frustrated in trying to see a change, trying to treat a person who is deeply in need. And I think it's therefore not just sort of pinning it on if only drug companies had stayed in the mix. I think we all need to kind of come together and look to a different way of doing things. So our role at Alto will be to provide these medicines and the tests that go with them. Everything is hand in hand, the new medicine and the new test. But in engaging with the world around us, with patients, with their family members, with clinicians, we're also hoping to change the narrative. I want people, I want patients, I want providers, I want insurance companies to demand that we take a precision approach, because why shouldn't we? I mean, we owe it, I think, to people who we are trying to help to do that if it becomes an option. And so that's where, from my perspective, it's a cultural conversation as well as a biotechnology conversation.
When you think about Alto, would you describe it as a biomarker platform? Would you describe it as a drug development company? Or is it some hybrid combination of both?
It's definitely a hybrid combination. I think ultimately our products are drugs. They're new medicines that all have a test to go with them. So they are new medicines made specific and targeted through a biomarker. So in that sense, you can never take the drug and the biomarker apart from each other. It doesn't even make sense to do, not just on the basic premise that we need precision, but because that is actually how these two things will be implemented in practice. You will have to take a test. in order to know if that drug is for you, because if you're not positive on that test, you probably don't want to waste your time with that drug. But if you are positive, you probably don't want to waste your time with anything but that drug. So we ultimately create these medicines with a test hand in hand. But to do so, I think it's probably best not to bucket us into a biomarker or a drug company, because those have historical framings that are limited. Drug companies developing drugs in an all-comer, kind of unimaginative way, and biomarker companies not developing an actual intervention, just focusing on measurement. It's got to go in hand. And as I mentioned, our ethos is almost a tech company ethos, which is heavy on what can we learn from data? How do we mine this data? How do we do our job better? How do we make it go faster and cheaper and more effectively? So there's no word for what that is. Maybe the word is Alto. I'll take that. But that's the ethos we're trying to embody.
Can you tell us a little bit, and I know you probably can't go into a lot of detail, but can you talk a little bit about the clinical stage assets, the drugs that you're working on, and what indications they're going to be targeted toward, and where you are with those?
Yep, absolutely. So as of today, we have 11 clinical stage drugs, which is obviously a huge number, also representing a wide variety of different biological mechanisms. But they're all organized into very specifically designed core thematics. And those core thematics are as follows. We have landscaped, we have looked around just from my own experience, that of others on the team over years, what are the core aspects of brain function that we need to move in order to improve a variety of mental functions and people's symptoms and their capacity to function in daily life. That brought us down to 3 core domains. And those 3 core domains are not only things that our drugs are targeted towards, but also the things that our biomarkers measure. One of them is cognition. Cognition refers to things like attention, working memory, ability to retain information in mind, ability to learn and recall information, even the ability of the brain just to undergo plasticity. That is the ability of the brain simply to change and be able to take information from the world around us and formulate it differently. Cognition is important for all psychiatric disorders. It's abnormal to different degrees in different psychiatric disorders, but they all have that. Of course, different people with a particular disorder may differ quite dramatically in terms of their impairments in cognition. So we think that cognitive interventions, cognitive drugs that also improve symptoms can have very broad effects. We're focusing that initially in depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, but very quickly moving into areas like bipolar depression for a host of reasons that all have to do with the centrality of cognition for our ability to regulate our behavior in the world, our emotions, and so forth. So we have several drugs and biomarkers geared at that. Another domain is what we call emotion and emotion regulation. So thinking about excessive negative emotion, anxiety, and avoidance, or impoverished positive emotion, and hedonia, the inability to feel pleasure and be motivated to pursue goals. That's a whole other area that's underpinned by different brain circuitry. So whereas cognitive circuitry is in the cortex and in certain areas like the hippocampus, which is deep in the brain, emotion involves very different areas of the cortex and different areas deeper in the brain, like the amygdala, which is an area that governs both positive and negative emotion, as well as other areas that are more kind of drive related. And so we have interventions and biomarkers geared at emotional processes and ability to regulate emotion. And the third is sleep. And by sleep, I really mean sleep, the amount of it, the timing of it, the structure of it, but also your daytime activity patterns, circadian rhythms. Do you sleep too much, too little? Is your sleep disrupted during the night? Are you engaging in as much activity just during the day? That's an important part of how we physically interact with the world. And indexing your rhythms throughout the day and in your sleep and activity. All of those things can again be manipulated through a medicine and measured through a biomarker. So those are the 3 categories. We're continuing to add in new drugs, and we will continue. We'll always continue, I think, to deepen the pipeline. With 11 drugs currently, and maybe by this airing even more, one of our areas of focus is actually not just advancing the drug, but understanding which ones should we not really spend time on? Which program should we kill because it's not that promising? How do we get information as early as possible about whether a program is promising or not? So I expect full well that over the next 6 months, 12 months, we'll increase our pipeline in some ways, we'll decrease our pipeline in other ways, but in all cases be driven by the guidance around core thematics, cognition, emotion, and sleep, and the ability to measure at a biomarker level what's going on.
It sounds like the ability to image the brain activity, to see what's working and what's not working, to use that to inform drug discovery, drug development for certain populations, and then give it to those people, see if it's working, that all of this is going to radically change how psychiatry is executed in the future. Is that fair to say? I mean, I think it could be that substantial.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a 0 to 1 kind of question. Right now, we do, as we talked about, trial and error, and it's horribly uninformed, very frustrating, and just frankly has poor outcomes. And those poor outcomes, by the way, are so obvious, right? In the world around us, we see the mental health crisis evolving and get magnified by COVID, but it's always been there, and unless we do something differently, it will always be there. So yeah, my view is that if we can do this right, it can be completely transformative, and not just for one drug, but for across multiple conditions. Just think of the opportunity here when you develop a medicine that has a biomarker with it in one condition, let's just say depression for the sake of argument. Because I now know the biology, the best response to it, I can look at that same biology in other disorders. Maybe cognition and schizophrenia, which we know is really important, ought to be another target, or bipolar depression, or addiction, or autism, and numerous other conditions. If we have that biology that anchors the drug, that takes us beyond symptoms and arbitrary constructions of checklists of symptoms that we use to make our diagnoses, that itself is also transformative. The ability now to take knowledge about what works for whom and find the other for whoms in other conditions that could benefit from the same drug, that's huge. That accelerates our clinical progress just as well. But one of the things that we also think about in this is how do we get people to even take these tests? Are we requiring that all psychiatrists and all primary care docs who prescribe most of the antidepressants, for example, today, or nurses, people providing the care, do we require all of them to know how to do these sorts of tests and how to interpret these sorts of tests? And I think the short answer there is we have to think about it in a different way in order to achieve that transformation. So at Alto, the way we think about it is, actually, I'd like a lot of these tests to be done in people's homes, either because it's a remote tool like a cognitive behavioral test battery that they do on a computer or wearable device, or maybe somebody comes to their home and does an EEG for them. And that's already a model that exists for neurological disorders. To try to separate the clinical implementation and the need to have clinicians who have never grown up in the context of neuroscience, separate that aspect and not worrying about having to suddenly train them on an entirely new field from the way we get tests to people, where the clinician can interpret the test in a face valid, simple way. The FDA has said this test rules you in for this drug. The patient got a positive result on this test. I'll consider prescribing that drug. So we work with the current clinical workflows, but provide a solution almost in parallel to those that directly informs and enrich the process of treating patients.
How often would you like to see a patient tested who's taking one of these drugs?
So I think that's in part to be determined as the information comes out. I would imagine that there's going to be, for any test, a reasonable stability over the span of months, and maybe either twice a year, once a year, it's worth revisiting these tests, especially if the person is continues to be symptomatic. You may even want to do that considerably more frequently, because maybe none of these tests are perfect, right? Maybe that's not quite the right one for them, and something else as informed by another test would be helpful. in a very blue sky downstream kind of way, what I'd love to be able to do is introduce the concept of brain vitals. That is, like a vital sign, measure heart rate and blood pressure, all of these basic things that we're used to doing when we go to see the doctor and tell them about our general health. The same should be true over time for the brain. And so we call them brain vitals. And I think the transition from a biomarker, a test that's a one-time test to tell you if you're eligible for a drug, to a continuous measurement to tell you about the health of your brain and the outcome of that drug and the risk for relapse and so forth. That's a very smooth transition. We're not ready for that yet. The data's not there yet, but you can quickly see, I think, how just getting a lot of information to rule you in, if you keep tracking that, which we do in our studies routinely, that can lead ultimately to a brain vital. I mean, to me, this is a continued conversation that you have with the patient, not just how do I select the drug, but how do I know it's working and how do I keep you well? And how do I avoid relapse, knowing what happened to you last time you relapsed, or knowing that this drug has particular attributes? How do I look forward in time and try to help you stay clear of any problems as a patient with any condition? That's just as much a brain question as anything else. And I'd love for us to be able to have brain conversations instead of only symptom conversations, and quite frankly, brain conversations, to harken back to the name of this podcast, rather than stigma conversations. That changes fundamentally the way we can talk about these conditions, because the first step out of the gate is I'll have a test for you to tell you if you're eligible for this medicine. Downstream, I'll be able to follow your progress with tests that tell me how you're doing. I don't know. To me, that's really hopeful in terms of cracking the code on the stigma that has held back so many from getting diagnosed and treated in every condition that's out there in psychiatry.
I have this sort of thought that comes into my mind around mental health, that we're still sort of in the stone ages of mental health. And when I hear you talk about what you're doing and how different it is from what's been done in the past when it comes to drug development, it just confirms that for me, because it sounds like the way we've done it before seems so barbaric. This idea that we put a drug into a mouse, something happens, we think that might translate to humans, we put it into 50 or 100 or 200 humans, some probability of outcome occurs, and then we go give it to millions of people just hoping that it will work. It just seems troubling to me that that's the way we've done it. It does make me feel like we're still in the stone ages when it comes to treating our mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just the way you've just described it, right? I think one has to separate the root cause, which is exactly as you said, we develop these drugs in mice. We know, by the way, that these animal studies generally don't translate at all really to understanding what works in people. We basically roll the die in terms of whether a clinical trial works just by chance. 94% of them fail. Something happens to work. It's just slightly better than placebo. It's not really that compelling, and we put it on the clinic. But the clinicians treating patients, I think, have the best intention at mind. They don't want to do this. I don't think patients want to do this. I don't think anybody benefits at any level from trial and error, from long sort of lag times in terms of knowing whether a treatment works once you give it to a person, and then not knowing if something fails any more about what the next step should be versus just flipping a coin. So I think that if you couple the desire amongst clinicians and obviously patients for better treatments faster, and now move it upstream to how we create those treatments and just simply thinking about it differently, to start measuring differently and acting differently, I think we get out of those, as you said, sort of barbaric times or maybe simply ill-informed times to get transformative change. And what's most exciting to me, to be perfectly blunt, is that we could do this now. To me, the solution doesn't have to be perfect the first time. It just has to be better than what we're doing, and it has to be now, because the doing it now will force us to figure out how do we really solve it for the clinic, for people in the near term, and we'll continue to improve, we'll continue to iterate as we do this more, but I want to see that solution now.
Well, just as somebody who's struggled with mental health, with addiction, with bipolar disorder, with depression, anxiety, it's really comforting to know that you're doing this. And I'm really grateful that you're doing it. And I think you're going to help an incredible number of people. And I'm just really happy that we get to be a part of it. And like I said, mostly grateful from a personal perspective that you're doing it. It's truly amazing.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate that. This is something that's been so important to me personally, important to the team, and just really motivating to see impact on the world around us.
As we come to the end of our time here, I'm a novice at most of the concepts you've mentioned here. I appreciate you breaking this down and explaining it in a way that a layperson can understand it. What question should I have asked? What am I missing here that we should understand about the work that you're doing?
I think that's captured it. I think we've talked a lot about all the key issues. There's so many elements here that we can take apart. And maybe one thing we didn't talk about is even how we do our trials. That deserves, I think, mention because it's part of the big picture, which is traditionally pharma has developed these drugs in such unrealistic and refined populations. For example, we know that the standard scenario with somebody with depression is that they have other what we call comorbid or co-occurring disorders. For example, anxiety or PTSD might come with it. And yet those people have been ruled out of trials. And people are coming through all sorts of routes that are just not reflective of real world care. To me, that's been part of the reason why these studies have failed, because they're just not reflecting what really happens in the real world, so that even when they succeed, when they get into the real world, the results are underwhelming. So we've changed that mode of thinking as well. We do all of our own clinical trials are led through our team here. We've developed a whole clinical infrastructure to work with real world clinics seeing patients, and a lot of patients day to day, whose motivation is singular, which is get people better. And not do it in this sort of highly refined artificial way that drug companies have done historically, but try to take a much broader swath of the population as it exists in the real world to make sure that our medicines work for real people, our biomarkers work for real people. And by the way, in doing that, because we're working with real world clinics, we can get much bigger numbers of people through our studies faster as well. So that helps the development process in creating the data that we need. But even more importantly than what we put out at the end of this will be drugs, medicines that truly help people out there in the world. And just questioning, frankly, everything that's been done historically, because it hasn't worked, just like that example, and rethinking it in a way that does work with this new lens, I think will have benefit.
There's no doubt in my mind that it'll have an incredible benefit. And like I said, I'm grateful that you're doing it. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time today to come here and explain your work to us and to our listeners and to some of the folks out there that are in need of your help and letting them know that it's coming. So thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure, and look forward to seeing this progress.
Thank you again, Amit, for being here today and sharing with us. The work you're doing is truly going to change the human experience. And I am really grateful that we get to be a small part of that. And as someone who's lived with the indications you're solving for, it means the world to me to get to be a part of it and just to get to see you bringing these solutions to market and changing the way psychiatry will be deployed to humans in the future. There are a number of ways to connect with Amit, all of which will be linked in the show notes. To our listeners, thank you for being here. And please, if you like the content, give us a subscribe or a like or a review on your podcast platform of choice. And more importantly, we'd love to hear from you. We'd also love for you to share this episode with a friend. To the founders out there, don't forget to join the Mental Health Startup Slack community, which you can also find a link to in the show notes. And check out the What If Fellowship Program, which is an 8-week accelerator that we've built to help mental health and digital health startups broadly validate their ideas and perfect their business plans and prepare to pitch investors. You can learn more about that through the fellowship tab on the What If Ventures website, which is also linked in the show notes. Finally, we want to hear from our listeners. As I mentioned before, please do comment on social media. Let us know what you liked, what you want to hear more of, what you disagreed with. You can reach out to us on Twitter @StigmaCast and on Instagram @StigmaPodcast. You can email us info@stigmapodcast.com, and you can find us on our website, stigmapodcast.com as well. Thank you for being here. And until next time, stay safe, be well, and thank you for your support.